Hey, what's up, guys? I'm Sci-Hi. Please like and subscribe if you're interested in more mythic, historic, and standard gameplay, as well as in-depth deck analysis. Because today we're going to take a look at this new kind of Azorius Lotus deck that's been around for a while. This kind of way to cheat Lotus Field into play, but it seems to be picking up popularity. There's a lot of different ways you can do it. We see some people going the Jeskai route with cheating and taking extra turns and just getting a lot of mana and value that way. But today we're going to look at just a hardcore Azorius full control version of the deck, exploiting the Lotus Field combo, of course. And when I say Lotus Field combo, maybe that's not the right way to put it, but of course what we're talking about is Lotus Field, which is a very interesting land. Hexproof, enters the play tapped. When it enters the battlefield, we sack 2 lands, and we get to add 3 mana of any one color. So, by itself, a very fair card, getting high cost to sack 2 lands, and then we just make a triple land, basically. But there's multiple ways to exploit it in red as well. But in Azorius, the way we're going to exploit it is, of course, with Strict Proctor, which is a 2-mana 1/3 flyer that says whenever a permanent enters the battlefield, causes a triggered ability to trigger, that ability is countered unless its controller pays 2 colorless. So obviously what we do, we play a Lotus Field after Strict Proctor is in play, and then we don't pay the cost. So the triggered ability to sack the 2 lands is countered, and then we just get a free Lotus Field without having to pay the normal fair cost that we are supposed to do to actually get to use this land. So that's pretty sick. Another way we can get it into play even earlier than turn 3, and before I cover that, keep in mind, if you're on turn 3 and you haven't played your 3rd land yet, when you cast Strict Proctor, if it resolves, your opponent has passed priority to you. So then you can play the Lotus Field, and basically there's no way they can really interact with that unless they have there's nothing really they can do, so that it's going to come into play. But anyways, the other ways to cheat this thing into play is with the old classic card from Scourge that a lot of people have even forgotten is historic legal, but it's Stifle. 1 blue, we can counter an activated or triggered ability. So this can counter a lot of different things. We could counter a Muxus coming into play from a Goblin player. But there's a lot of things we can counter of our opponents, but we've got one floating around the deck just for the second turn Lotus Field drop, where we've got 1 blue mana, drop Lotus Field. Going to want to hold control before you do that, so that you can, it may not be necessary, but just out of safety, I usually do it myself. You'll want to test this, make sure you do it right before you pilot this deck. Maybe on the ladder. But anyways, yeah, you're playing Lotus Field and you're countering the ability that way with Stifle, so you don't have to sacrifice the 2 lands. So that's the whole point of the deck, of getting Lotus Field into play and abusing having way more mana than you otherwise should early in the game. Beyond just Strict Proctor enabling this Lotus Field interaction, Strict Proctor is also not a bad card just on its own. 1/3 flyer, that's fine for holding down some early pressure. Other creatures can block, can even pressure opposing planeswalkers in the air if you're up against control. But that ability is quite strong and hits a lot of other things. Your opponent is going to have a pain being taxed to pay 2 mana to get their triggers. For example, there's a lot of the Selesnya life gain decks where they use Soul Wardens and things that gain life when creatures enter the battlefield. This suddenly really chokes that off completely, because they're just not going to have the mana to pay the tax. So it shuts off all of that, shuts off just a ton of things in the format that would otherwise be triggered by entering the battlefield, and your opponent just doesn't have the mana to deal with it. So there's a lot of incidental just advantage from running this card when it's already part of your game plan. And then to get additional splash damage with this thing against decks is pretty brutal, and feels bad for your opponent when your enabling guy is also like crippling their main strategy, it just completely wrecks enters the battlefield decks, or like just other decks that, you know, cycle in creatures to get ETB effects. So it's a really a bomb card for sure. Fits nicely here. So if we look at the rest of the deck, we'll take a look at what are we doing with all this mana that we can generate. There's a lot of different payoffs we can do in this particular deck. In a nutshell, we're going to try to use Hullbreaker Horror to full effect. I'll go over all the cards in a moment, but the general game plan is to get a ton of mana earlier than we should and be able to totally go off with Hullbreaker Horror and kind of go into God mode and just control the game. But in addition to Hullbreaker Horror, we have various other mana sinks and things we can spend our mana on. So without further ado, we'll start from the beginning and just take a look at what we got rolling here. So like most good Azorius control decks, we've got our one copy of Search for Azcanta. Sometimes you see two copies. It's maybe a little bit over aggressive, but for sure this card's a bomb. One copy is very good here. Again, it's a 2 mana enchantment. We're getting to, in a way, scry every upkeep and look and control what we draw, or we can put it in the graveyard. A lot of times you're going to be putting cards in the graveyard to get this to turn into Azcanta, the Sunken Ruin, as soon as possible, which is just an incredible land for 3 mana. Look at the top 4 cards of our library and reveal a non-creature or non-land card. So late game, this is another sink that we can use our extra mana on to just constantly get value and keep searching for more action, counter spells, cards, whatever we need to find. Search for Azcanta, we'll find it. It's an awesome card for sure. We've also got, in addition, we covered the 4 Strict Proctors, but we've also got 3 Fae of Wishes. So if you see here, even though this is a high-end control deck, we've still got some early game defensive creatures, as well as just enabling effects. And Fae of Wishes is a very interesting card. So, you know, at the worst case, it's a 1/4 flyer that can defend and hold down the fort early to make sure you can survive to the mid to late game and go off with all this mana. But the granted ability on Fae of Wishes is truly something special. We get to reveal a non-creature card we own from outside the game and put it into our hand. Now, that's good in all situations, best of 3 or best of 1, but in best of 1, this card particularly shines because obviously there's no sideboarding in best of 1, so it's hard to be prepared for everything. But with a card like Fae of Wishes and the mana to you oftentimes search for a card and cast the same card you search for in the same turn, because we've got all these freaking Lotus Fields just adding so much mana to our pool, Fae of Wishes can really be a bomb in an archetype like this. So in best of 1, like I said, we can't prepare for everything because we can't sideboard. But in this way, Fae of Wishes kind of functions like we have a sideboard in best of 1, at least a pseudo sideboard, as it were, of 7 cards. So as you would imagine, we've got 7 kind of silver bullet cards for various different situations. If you follow me and have seen a lot of my decks, you know I'm a big fan of Rest in Peace. So we've got 1 copy that we can go find with Fae of Wishes. Rest in Peace is the best anti-graveyard card in the game. It's not only vaporizes, gets rid of everything when it enters the battlefield, which, keep in mind, that you will have to actually pay the tax if you do have a Strict Proctor in play. That's a non-bow we're willing to deal with, because even if you can't pay the tax, it's still going to prevent all future cards from going to graveyards and completely get rid of all graveyards in the game. There's so many powerful graveyard decks in Historic that we need to have at least 1 copy of Rest in Peace so we can go fetch. In addition, we've got 1 copy of Dovin's Veto, so we can go fetch up a counter spell. Maybe our board state's already good. We're looking pretty good in the game, but we just need to bolster our hand with some more counter spells to be able to fight off any future threats that our opponent may have. So we've got 1 copy of Dovin's Veto to go fetch. Very potent, powerful counter spell effect that also can't be countered itself. We've also got 1 copy of Ixalan's Binding, another hot card, 4 mana enchantment. just for spot removal on any non-land permanent our opponent happens to have. And if it resolves, we can, we exile the permanent and they can't cast it ever again. And again, remember, all these ETB effects do have the tax with the Strict Proctor. So just be careful when you are going for your own ETB effects. And there's not many, there's really none in the main deck because we don't want to nombo in that way. But some of these silver bullet cards, we're willing to make that sacrifice. So just make sure that you have, if you do actually have Strict Proctor in play, make sure you have at least 2 colorless access so you don't look like a fool and counter your own ability. But anyways, Ixalan's Binding is in there for a silver bullet against any potential bad permanents that we can't deal with. Moving on, we got 1 copy of Cleansing Nova. We can go fetch, just another Wrath of God, but also can destroy all artifacts and enchantments. Also, again, if you've watched previous videos, you know I'm a big fan of enchantment decks and the Prison Lock combo with 9 lives. Well, if you're up against the 9 lives deck, now you have a toolkit. You can go access Cleansing Nova, kill all enchantments, and if your opponent has 9 lives in play, just kill them. But again, just another silver bullet card if you're up against some weird deck that's running a lot of enchantments or artifacts. There's been some of those affinity builds that have been kind of gaining popularity as well. This can just crush all the artifacts your opponent has. So very good one of that we can go find if the situation calls for it. We've also got 1 copy of Approach of the Second Sun because, hey, sometimes the game just gets really crazy and we just need a way to outright win the game. It's it's crazy out there in ranked land, and sometimes you just need to gain some life. Even the 7 life can be relevant if we're too low and need to pad our life total. But again, just an alternate win con that we can find. And all of this, again, is just floating in our sideboard. So none of this stuff is like diluting our deck with weird things that otherwise wouldn't be good. It's awesome that you can have a card like Fae of Wishes that has function and can just find these silver bullet cards. A lot of time the limiting factor with this card is just not having enough mana or time to make it possible. But again, when you're rocking 4 Lotus Fields and cheating them into play quickly, Fae of Wishes suddenly looks like an all-star when you can just access all of this stuff. But anyways, I'd love to hear what you guys think should be the 7-card silver bullet list, because it's certainly an interesting discussion. This is my approach here. I'll explain my sentiment. But again, let me know in the comments if you have other cards that should be in here that I haven't considered, because there are a lot of them. But moving on, we talked about Approach with the Second Sun. We also got 1 copy of Ugin, probably one of the most powerful things you can do in the game for 8 mana. One of the most powerful planeswalkers, hands down, being that it is 8 mana, though. It's usually difficult to cast. But again, we've got a lot of mana in this deck, so sometimes this is just the perfect answer to close the game, and we can just comfortably go find him, search him up, cast him, and slowly grind out and win the game after that. Lastly, we've got 1 copy of Sphinx's Revelation. Just another gain life outlet if we need life, as well as this is a card where sometimes you'll be going and searching for this when there isn't really like an obvious answer, or maybe you're in an okay spot. You don't particularly need anything else, but just more life and more cards from your own deck are the ticket to victory. So you go search up Sphinx's Revelation. And again, with all these Lotus Fields, you have all this mana. So your Sphinx's Revelations, usually on end step, you're going to cast it on your opponent's end step. You're going to gain a shit ton of life, draw a shit ton of cards, and that's just backbreaking for your opponent. You're just burying them in card draw. A lot of times you get people to tap out just from resolving a huge-ass Sphinx's Revelation. So that's a fun one for sure. So that's the silver bullet list, all courtesy of Fae of Wishes. If we move on to the 3-drop spot, we've got 4 Archmage's Charm, 3 blue, but we absolutely can support 3 blue in a deck like this when we've got one singular land that can just so happen to add 3 blue by itself. Archmage Charm is very easy to support in an Azorius build. It's one of the most versatile and powerful cards ever printed, for real. being able to counter a spell or draw 2 cards, as well as the gain control of a non-land permanent with mana value 1 or less, which is probably the least used mode, but when it's relevant, it's absolutely insane, backbreaking for your opponent, stealing a creature from an aggro deck, using it to block another creature that they're going to choose to attack with or do whatever with. It's incredible. And just 4 counter spells. We need counter spells. This is a control deck after all, but if there isn't anything to counter, this can always just function as a draw 2 at your opponent's end step. Very powerful. Again, we can support it very easily in this deck. Now, I just realized I may have forgotten one thing in the 2-drop spot. I forgot to cover the Revitalizes. So, as we talked about in this deck, the main purpose is to totally break and abuse Hullbreaker Horror. So, to do that, we want to cast as many spells as possible once we get this guy online. Just start in that way. Then, once we start countering stuff, we're bouncing everything our opponent has in play. We're returning everything to their hand that they try to cast. And it just feels like God mode when you get everything online. You have all the mana and you're just abusing this card to its fullest. But to do that, we have to be able to get to the somewhat end game still alive. So Revitalize, we've got 3 copies of Revitalize, 2 mana, gain 3 life, draw a card. This can let us survive the early game and cantrip and just find more things. Cantrips in this deck are good because not only does it thin our deck and we get through more cards to find our Lotus Fields to abuse them, once we have Hullbreaker Horror in play, cantrips are awesome because we just want to cast spells and get these activated abilities to totally wreck our opponent. So even in the late game, even if you don't need life, at worst, this is just a cantrip where you're going to draw a card, gain 3 life, and then you're going to either get to sort of effectively counter one of their spells or bounce another permanent and just make life a living hell for your opponent once you get all these things going. So I mentioned cantrips being good. In addition, cards that function as like 2 cards cast in 1 are really good for Hullbreaker Horror because it's just that many more activations we're going to get off this guy. So I already mentioned Fae of Wishes and how powerful that is, but you're casting 2 cards potentially because you're casting Granted, as well as then casting the Fae of Wishes itself, the creature form. That's 2 activations from Hullbreaker Horror right there from 2 cards. Plus, it found Granted, or you cast Granted, so you're getting another card to potentially trigger off of. In addition, we didn't even talk about the 2 mana activated ability, where you can just discard 2 cards. Oftentimes, just discard 2 lands. You're returning Fae of Wishes to your hand, recycling it, and you get to do the whole thing again, and around we go. And it's not that too crazy to actually do this. Once you get all this mana in play, it just gets disgusting. You have so many recurring things happening. You're just casting spells, you're searching for cards, you're bouncing things, you're pseudo countering cards that they're trying to cast. Everything they try to do, you're just returning, and it basically feels like God mode. And the game gets so fun at that point in your favor that people usually just tap out because it's so demoralizing to play when everything you're trying to do is getting handled. So again, I talked about these Throne of Eldraine, like storybook cards are good with Hullbreak because we cast 2 cards in 1. So we talked about Archmage Charm. In addition to the 3-drop spot, we've got another all-star card in the Brazen Borrower. 3 copies. So we get Petty Theft, the left side of the card. We get to bounce things. And then in addition, we get a 3/1 flyer for Flash. 3/1 flyer with Flash, rather. So this is awesome, again, with Hullbreaker Horror because you're going to get 2 activations from Hullbreaker Horror from 1 card. And, I mean, you can just imagine how disgusting it is when you have this in play. You cast Petty Theft to bounce 1 thing. That gets you another trigger. You bounce another thing. And now then you can play a 3/1 flyer and you get to bounce another thing. They're not going to have any permanents in play. You're just bouncing everything. So that's kind of the purpose and idea behind these storybook cards that are normally a little bit slower to resolve everything. But again, when we've got all this mana, we can just go off and do whatever we want because we have the mana to support it. So that's what these are in here for. In addition, just the Petty Theft early, another 2 mana spell, can just bounce a creature, bounce a creature that's attacking us, an aggro deck, and just survive that kind of early to mid game, so we can get hopefully 1 or 2 Lotus Fields online, and then survive to get a Hullbreaker Horror out, and then it's just game over from there once we start comboing off with all these effects. So moving on, 4-drop spot. Nothing special, but we do have 4 copies of Wrath of God, especially in Best of 1 Historic. Can be an aggro heavy format. There's elves, there's goblins, there's lots of things where Wrath of God is just kind of mandatory to destroy everything. We could potentially shave down maybe one of these, because we do have some of our own creatures to kind of hold down the fort and survive the early game as well. But this is a control deck after all. 4 Wrath of Gods. It's really not too bad in the meta we're in right now, especially Best of 1, when there's just so much aggro floating around. So 4 Wrath of Gods. And we also have got 3 Memory Deluge, just another card that's maybe a little bit slow, but this is another card where I talked about where we're basically casting 2 cards in 1, and we have the mana to do it. So we can Memory Deluge at our opponent's end step, find 2 cards, flashback, do it again for 7, which is a piece of cake again when we have all this mana, and you're just casting spells, finding exactly what you need, and just finishing the end game like a champ, really. So Memory Deluge is really a powerful card when you have the mana to support it, for sure. You're just not going to run out of things to do. You're going to just keep finding cards. You flash it back, you find another Memory Deluge, maybe a counter spell to back it up, and everything snowballs out of control, and you just sail to victory from that point. Then we got, no surprise here, 3 copies of Teferi, Hero of Dominaria. Just one of maybe the best Planeswalker in Historic, in my opinion. Perfect Azorius Control Planeswalker. I'm not going to go at length talking about this guy. I've done so in other videos, but does everything you need, especially after a board wipe. You're drawing cards, spot removal, can even prevent yourself from decking in weird situations where you want to use the second ability, Tuck himself. So 3 copies, just a powerful, strong card. And then, of course, we talked about the point of the deck in Hullbreaker Horror, which is just a champ and all-star here. 3 copies of it as well. Onto the lands. We've got a lot of them. We've got 28 total lands. The reason for that is that when you're running Lotus Field, in certain situations where if things don't go according to plan and we don't cheat it into play, it's important to have all of these lands, a lot of lands, and not miss drops, because if you have Lotus Fields early and no way to cheat them into play, you can essentially get totally choked out on lands if you don't hit all your drops. If you're forced to play this in a non-cheating fair way and you actually have to sack the 2 lands, it's important to have a lot of lands so we don't miss our drops, because you don't want to play this. If you want to cheat it into play, of course, obviously, right? But if you can't, and you actually have to play it for its fair effect, where you have to sack the lands, we have to hit our land drops and make sure that we have 2 lands to sack if we absolutely have to play it in a fair way. But moreover, just a control deck like this wants a lot of lands anyways. You really don't want to miss your drops, because I mentioned we've got so many double cards and mana sinks where we can use our mana with Search for Azcanta, or when it becomes Azcanta, that having a lot of land is just great in a control deck. So we'll wrap things up here, but in addition to just a smattering of good white-blue lands, more mana sinks, we've got 1 Castle Vantress, again, another way to just spend your mana, and then 2 Castle Ardenvale to perpetually just keep creating 1/1s, and with the untap ability from Teferi, and just the mass mana that this deck generates, oftentimes, if you don't have anything else to do, you can get multiple activations of these in turns and still keep up mana to counterspell things or dig up more cards. But that's the deck. Let me know what you guys think. It feels like absolute god mode once you get this stuff online. Hullbreaker Horror is just this disgusting house to deal with once you untap or have enough mana to start getting value out of it right away. But one of the just kind of unsung all-stars of this deck, I know I talked a lot about it already, but this Fae of Wishes, especially in best of one, when you have an arsenal of silver bullets, is quite extraordinary, and it's been really powerful for me. It feels really good when you don't have a sideboard, but you still have just this list of silver bullet cards that you can call on when you need them. But I'd be very curious to know what you guys think. I mean, there's other cards to consider for this. This is kind of my basic approach to handle different situations. Again, in the open meta game, there's so many variety of ways we can lose and strategies that our opponent will try to use against us. There's other things we could consider, like if Storm gets stronger, we could consider running cards that there's an enchantment where we could allow only one spell to be cast per turn. So that's really the beauty of finding a pet deck in a best of one or even best of three. These silver bullet lists will change over time depending on the meta and as new cards come out. So it's really fun to just keep crafting and leaving the core deck intact or making tweaks here and there, but just exploring and experimenting with different cards here is definitely a lot of fun. So anyways, guys, let me know what you think. Please like, subscribe, share the deck. I'm curious to know how you guys or other people are building this deck. This is just one way. Like I said, there's Jeskai Turn's way and other cards to abuse, getting lots of mana with. But this is a solid deck for sure. I've piloted this enough to know that a lot of the numbers make sense, and maybe some subtle tweaks here and there depending on how the meta shakes out for the next few weeks. But it's a very cool deck for sure. Let me know what you guys think, and as always, good luck on the ladder. Peace.